the performance that took American Bandstand off the air. I used to think American Bandstand ended because people simply stopped caring about Dick Clark and the music he introduced. Then I dug deeper, and that explanation started falling apart. The strange part is that the show survived rock and roll, soul, disco, new wave, and even a major payola scandal, yet television itself eventually became the thing it couldn't outrun. And there was one performance that became part of that much bigger story. To understand how American Bandstand finally disappeared, you have to forget the ending for a moment. Go back to the beginning. Philadelphia, 1952. The show was simply called Bandstand, and it wasn't supposed to become a national institution. Teenagers gathered in a television studio, listened to records, and danced. That's basically it. But something about it worked. Then Dick Clark arrived. He wasn't the original host. Bob Horn was. But after Horn's 1956 arrest for driving under the influence, Clark stepped in. And honestly, Clark may have been exactly what the show needed. Rock and roll frightened a lot of adults in the 1950s. Parents heard the music and worried about what it represented. Dick Clark understood that. He gave the music a clean-cut face. The teenagers could dance. The singers could perform. The records could become hits. And parents could look at Clark and think, okay, maybe this isn't so dangerous. That little trick helped transform a Philadelphia afternoon program into American Bandstand. By 1957, it was national. Within months, millions were watching. Paul Anka appeared. Frankie Avalon became a teen idol. Connie Francis gained attention. Black artists like Chuck Berry and later James Brown reached an enormous television audience. And then something even bigger happened. In 1960, Chubby Checker appeared on the program with The Twist. The song and dance exploded. What fascinates me is that American Bandstand wasn't merely reporting what teenagers liked. It was helping decide what America would hear next. And that power eventually created a problem. The payola scandal. By 1960, Congress was investigating whether money and business relationships were influencing which records received exposure. Dick Clark was pulled directly into the controversy. Investigators found that he had financial interests connected to music companies and copyrights. Clark denied accepting payola, and ultimately he survived the investigation. But he was forced to sell his interests in various music-related businesses. Other DJs weren't nearly as fortunate. Some careers were destroyed. Clark's wasn't. And that's important because American Bandstand didn't disappear after the scandal. It kept going. It moved to Los Angeles in 1964. The Beach Boys fit perfectly into the new California setting. Then came the Doors. The Jackson 5. A young Michael Jackson. The Village People. Disco. And even the famous YMCA dance. Think about that for a second. A show that began with teenagers dancing in a Philadelphia studio had somehow remained relevant through multiple generations of music. So what finally went wrong? Television changed. By the 1980s, MTV had arrived. Now teenagers didn't have to wait for Saturday afternoon to discover music. They could turn on the television and watch music videos whenever they wanted. That was a completely different experience. And American Bandstand suddenly looked old-fashioned. But MTV wasn't the only problem. In 1984, changes involving televised college football created another headache. ABC affiliates increasingly wanted that valuable weekend airtime for football coverage. And local stations had a choice. They could keep American Bandstand. Or replace it with programming that could bring in more local advertising money. More stations dropped the show. That meant fewer viewers. Fewer viewers made the program less valuable. And that encouraged even more stations to drop it. It became a vicious cycle. By 1987, after more than 3 decades on ABC, American Bandstand's network run was over. But even then, it didn't completely disappear. It continued in syndication. And Dick Clark eventually stepped away from the host's chair. Then came October 7, 1989. Exactly 37 years after the original program began. American Bandstand aired its final episode. That ending feels almost strangely quiet considering what the show had accomplished. This wasn't a program that suddenly crashed. It didn't vanish because one artist gave a disastrous performance. It didn't die because teenagers suddenly hated Dick Clark. It simply belonged to a television world that was disappearing. And that's what I find most interesting. American Bandstand had survived scandals. It survived changing musical tastes. It survived the British invasion. It survived soul, disco, punk, and new wave. But eventually, the way Americans discovered music changed so dramatically that even Dick Clark couldn't hold the old system together. The performance that helped define the show was no longer enough. The audience wanted something different. And television gave it to them. Still, American Bandstand left behind something much bigger than a television show. It helped turn performers into stars. It brought new sounds into American living rooms. It gave teenagers a place on national television. And Dick Clark became the familiar face standing in the middle of all of it. When I look back at the final episode now, I don't see a failure. I see the end of an era. Because sometimes a show doesn't disappear because it became irrelevant. Sometimes it disappears because it was so important that the entire world around it changed. And American Bandstand had already changed America once. It just couldn't stop America from changing again.